Here's a question that will make you think. When was the last time you heard of an African nation imposing sanctions on the United States, or France, or any Western power for that matter? I'll wait. Can't think of one? That's because it's never happened. And that tells us everything we need to know about the broken global power structure we're living under today. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most glaring inequalities in international relations, the weaponization of sanctions against Africa, and why it's time for the continent to turn the tables. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth. Sanctions have become the West's favorite tool of control, not justice, control, and the evidence is everywhere. Take a look at recent history. Uganda, Niger, Gabon, and the Central African Republic were all recently kicked out of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Not because they committed war crimes or violated international law, but because they made political choices that didn't align with Western interests. Uganda passed legislation reflecting its cultural values, and Washington's response: travel bans on government officials. In Niger, when the military took control, the European Union didn't even wait for the dust to settle before slapping sanctions on the new leadership. This isn't diplomacy, it's economic blackmail, and the pattern is crystal clear. Step out of line with Western expectations and face the consequences. But here's what's truly shocking. With all the documented human rights abuses committed by Western powers across Africa, from colonial massacres to modern-day resource exploitation, not a single African nation has ever responded with sanctions of their own. Why? Let's put this in perspective. Africa has 54 countries. The entire Western Bloc, including the United States, Canada, and all of Europe, doesn't even come close to that number. If even half of Africa's nations decided to coordinate targeted sanctions against their former colonizers, the global balance of power would shift overnight. Imagine the message that would send. Imagine the economic impact. Yet Africa has remained restrained, diplomatic, always taking the high road. And what has that restraint earned the continent? More sanctions, more interference, more disrespect. History has a harsh lesson for those who listen. Restraint is rarely rewarded by bullies. Instead, it's often seen as weakness, an invitation for more aggression. Want to see how devastating these one-sided sanctions can be? Let's examine Eritrea, a perfect case study in Western overreach and institutional failure. In 2009, the UN Security Council imposed crushing sanctions on Eritrea, claiming the country was supporting terrorist groups in Somalia and engaged in conflict with Djibouti. The punishment was severe: arms embargoes, development aid cutoffs, military training suspensions. Then in 2011, they piled on more sanctions, targeting the Eritrean diaspora's income and mineral exploration rights. For 10 long years, Eritrea was economically strangled, isolated from the global community, its people suffering under the weight of international condemnation. Then, quietly, almost sheepishly, the world admitted the truth. There was no evidence. None. The sanctions were lifted in 2018, but by then, an entire decade had been lost. A country was economically destroyed based on unverified accusations. Families separated, development stunted, lives ruined. And when the truth finally emerged, there were no apologies, no reparations, no accountability for those who orchestrated this injustice. This brings us to a fundamental problem with our global governance system, the United Nations Security Council. 5 permanent members: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, hold veto power over the entire world. 3 of these are former colonial powers with direct interests in keeping Africa subservient. This undemocratic structure makes it nearly impossible for Africa, the Middle East, and the Global South to achieve fair representation or lasting peace. When the very institution meant to maintain global order is controlled by those who benefit from the current imbalance, how can we expect justice? But here's where it gets even more troubling. The West doesn't always need to impose sanctions directly anymore. They've found a more sophisticated approach, using African institutions to do their dirty work. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, has become particularly effective at this. Since 2019, following a wave of military takeovers, ECOWAS has sanctioned Sudan, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Gabon. Nearly 70% of recent African coups have been met with ECOWAS sanctions. But here's the contradiction that should alarm every African. These sanctions haven't prevented a single coup. If anything, they've backfired, further isolating already unstable governments and weakening regional unity. So why continue this failed strategy? The answer is uncomfortable but clear. ECOWAS is increasingly acting not in Africa's interests, but as an enforcer of Western policy. When an African organization consistently punishes African nations for making choices that displease Western powers, we have to ask, who are they really serving? The tragedy of Libya serves as a grim reminder of where this path leads. Once one of Africa's most prosperous nations, Libya was destroyed through a combination of sanctions, international isolation, and eventual military intervention. The country that once provided free education, healthcare, and housing to its citizens now exists as a failed state, a cautionary tale of what happens when Western powers decide a leader has outlived his usefulness. The destruction of Libya wasn't just about removing Muammar Gaddafi. It was about preventing the emergence of a unified, independent Africa. Gaddafi's plans for an African currency, an African central bank, and reduced dependence on Western financial systems posed an existential threat to neocolonial control. But change is coming. Some African nations are beginning to resist this one-sided system. Mali has openly opposed ECOWAS sanctions, choosing instead to strengthen ties with post-coup governments. This quiet rebellion is growing, and it shows that African unity can no longer be taken for granted when it conflicts with sovereignty. Countries across the continent are also looking eastward. China is already Africa's largest trading partner and investor. In Mali, French troops have withdrawn, replaced by Russian military support. Several African nations are applying to join BRICS, embracing a multipolar world order that doesn't revolve around Western dominance. Here's what the West doesn't want you to realize. Africa holds cards they desperately need. Essential minerals like cobalt, used in every smartphone and electric vehicle battery, come from African soil. Diamonds, gold, uranium. The resources that power Western technology and luxury markets are controlled by the very nations being sanctioned. Should Western pressure intensify, Africa could redirect these resources eastward, fundamentally disrupting global supply chains. With the green energy revolution demanding more African minerals than ever before, the continent's leverage is actually growing, not shrinking. The current U.S. approach exemplifies this Western miscalculation. President Biden's administration has announced plans to remove Uganda, Gabon, Niger, and the Central African Republic from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, officially citing human rights violations and democratic governance failures. But many across Africa see this differently, as punishment for independence, not principle. Uganda's exclusion threat came after passing legislation reflecting its cultural values. Niger and Gabon face removal following military takeovers that, while not ideal, reflected genuine popular frustration with failed civilian governments. This heavy-handed approach mirrors historical patterns where African nations are expected to conform to Western ideological frameworks, regardless of local context or popular will. It's cultural imperialism disguised as human rights advocacy. Consider this revealing contrast. While the U.S. threatens African nations with sanctions and trade exclusions, Russia recently facilitated grain shipments from Ukraine to ease food crises across Africa and the Middle East. Through Turkish mediation, Moscow helped prevent a humanitarian disaster that could have triggered social unrest, extremist recruitment, and mass migration toward Europe. Yet despite this diplomatic success that benefited millions of Africans, there was no Western recognition or goodwill. Instead, U.S. Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas-Greenfield issued stern warnings to African nations, even considering Russian oil purchases. This aggressive posture reveals a troubling truth. America has overplayed its hand. So what should Africa do? The time for one-sided restraint is over. Here's what a coordinated African response could look like. Economic leverage. Africa could impose targeted sanctions on Western companies exploiting African resources without fair compensation. Mining companies, agricultural exporters, and manufacturing firms operating under colonial-era agreements should face restrictions until terms are renegotiated fairly. Financial pressure. African nations could coordinate withdrawals from Western banks, redirecting funds to institutions that respect African sovereignty. This would send shockwaves through financial markets heavily dependent on African capital flows. Diplomatic isolation. Travel bans on Western officials and corporate leaders involved in exploitative practices. Visa restrictions for those who support or implement unjust sanctions against African nations. Resource redirection. Strategic partnerships with China, Russia, India, and other emerging powers to diversify trade relationships and reduce dependence on Western markets. Military independence. The dismantling of Western military bases across Africa, many of which serve intelligence and interference operations rather than genuine security cooperation. We're witnessing the birth of a new global order. The unipolar world dominated by the West since the end of the Cold War is giving way to a multipolar system where multiple centers of power compete and cooperate. Africa has a choice: remain on the sidelines as a victim of great power competition, or assert itself as an independent force shaping this new world order. The continent's young population, vast resources, and growing economic potential make it a natural leader in this transformation. But leadership requires courage. It requires unity, and it requires a willingness to use the considerable leverage Africa possesses. Africa has moral authority that the West lacks. The continent never colonized other regions, never imposed its cultural values through force, never destabilized governments for economic gain. This moral high ground, combined with economic leverage, creates a powerful foundation for principled resistance. When Africa speaks about sovereignty and self-determination, it speaks from experience as the victim of violations, not their perpetrator. This gives African positions a credibility that Western lectures about democracy and human rights simply cannot match. The digital revolution provides new tools for resistance. African nations can coordinate policy through secure communications, share intelligence about Western interference, and present unified positions in international forums more effectively than ever before. Social media and digital platforms also allow African voices to reach global audiences directly, bypassing Western media filters that often distort African perspectives. This informational independence is crucial for building international support for African positions. The African Union must transform from a Western-influenced talk shop into a genuine instrument of continental power. This means reforming decision-making processes to prevent external manipulation, establishing independent funding mechanisms, and developing collective security arrangements that don't depend on former colonial powers. Regional economic communities like ECOWAS need fundamental restructuring to serve African interests rather than Western convenience. Their current role as sanctions enforcers against fellow African nations is not just counterproductive, it's a betrayal of Pan-African principles. Climate change adds another dimension to this struggle. Africa contributes least to global emissions but suffers most from climate impacts. Yet Western sanctions often target the very infrastructure projects, power plants, transportation networks, industrial facilities that could help African nations adapt and develop sustainably. This environmental colonialism, where the West demands African compliance with climate policies while maintaining its own high-consumption lifestyle, provides additional justification for coordinated resistance. Africa can learn from other regions that have successfully challenged Western dominance. ASEAN has maintained independence while engaging economically with all major powers. Latin American countries have increasingly asserted sovereignty in recent decades. The Middle East has shown that oil-rich nations can leverage resources for political influence. But Africa's potential is even greater due to its size, population, and resource diversity. What the continent needs is the political will to act collectively. Africa's young population, the median age is just 19 years, represents both opportunity and urgency. This generation has grown up in a multipolar world and is less psychologically attached to Western approval than their predecessors. They're also more connected, more educated, and more aware of global power dynamics. If current trends continue, this generation will inherit a continent still subject to Western sanctions and interference. But if Africa acts now, they could inherit a truly independent continent that commands global respect. The age of silence and submission is over. The world is watching, and Africa is rising. But rising requires more than potential. It requires action. Every day that passes without a coordinated African response to Western sanctions is a day that reinforces the current imbalance. Every African leader who seeks Western approval while their neighbors face sanctions is contributing to the problem. The continent has the numbers, the resources, and the moral authority to demand better. What it needs now is the courage to use them. Imagine a world where 54 African nations speak with one voice, where Western companies can't exploit African resources without consequence, where African sovereignty is respected rather than violated. That world is possible, but only if Africa chooses to create it. The West's overconfidence in maintaining control through sanctions may prove to be their greatest strategic error. By pushing Africa toward Eastern partnerships and forcing the continent to consider alternatives, they may have accidentally accelerated their own decline. But this historic opportunity won't last forever. Windows of change have a way of closing as quickly as they open. Africa must act while it still has maximum leverage, while the global system is still fluid, while alternatives to Western dominance are still taking shape. The question isn't whether Africa can challenge the current system, it's whether Africa will challenge it. The continent holds the power. The only question is whether it will use it. This is more than just analysis. This is a call for African awakening. Share this video with every African you know. Let your leaders know that the people are ready for a different approach. Support African unity initiatives in your community. But most importantly, change how you think about Africa's place in the world. Stop accepting that sanctions are something that happen to Africa, not something Africa can impose. Stop believing that Western approval is necessary for African success. What do you think? Is it time for Africa to impose reciprocal sanctions on the West? Should the continent leverage its resources for political power? Are you ready to support a truly independent Africa, even if it means challenging the global status quo? Let me know in the comments below. And if this video opened your eyes to Africa's untapped potential, hit that like button and subscribe for more content that challenges conventional wisdom about African politics and power. Remember, every subscription helps spread the message that Africa's time is now. Turn on notifications so you never miss our latest analysis of African affairs and the continent's rise on the global stage. The future of Africa, and the world, may depend on how we respond to this moment. Let's make sure we get it right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.